Good morning, colleagues. Good morning. I think on the second day we can call each other friends already. We had a very rich program yesterday. I think it has been too diverse for me to summarize it. We will have a kind of summary at the end of this day, so I'll spare you that. You've seen yesterday we started the first day with what we call a spotlight session, a one-on-one on a specific topic that we felt needs specific highlighting. And we started yesterday with climate change and migration, and we ended the day with another spotlight session on instrumentalization. And the idea today is to warm up with our third spotlight session. We are focusing on, if you will, not on a migration topic per se, but on one of the sort of hot topics that we've been discussing: crisis, war in Ukraine, and use that first half hour to perhaps also start to look past the immediate conflict, and I hope I can stimulate Misha here to walk with me also perhaps through the wider possible consequences of the conflict. So the third spotlight session today will be looking at the wider implications of Russia's all-out war against Ukraine. So perhaps also here we then ask the eternal question also: where do Europe's borders begin and where do they end? Like in the previous spotlight sessions, we would start the conversation up here on the stage and then gradually loop you in, and I'm really encouraging you to join the conversation. And turning to Misha Glenny here next to me, I cannot think of a better person to have this conversation with than Misha Glenny, who is the rector of the Institute. Das Institut für die Wissenschaft für Menschen.
The Institute for Human Sciences.
The Institute for Human Sciences here in Vienna. A few words on that, because it's a fantastic institute. It was created, if I'm informed correctly, already in 1882. In 1882 here as a meeting place for dissenting thinkers of Eastern Europe and other prominent thinkers of the West. And since then it has turned into an institution that promotes intellectual exchange across almost all disciplines. And perhaps specifically important for our conversation here is the Institute's Ukraine program, which I believe is one of a kind, not just in Vienna, not just in Austria, not just in Europe, but in the world. Only, I think it's been last week, 10 days ago, the Institute gathered many of eminent speakers to one of your flagship events, the Humanities Festival, under the banner of the Age of Uncertainty, or in German Zeitenwende, a much quoted term, and a theme that reverberates also through our discussions here. Misha Glenny himself is an award-winning journalist, author, and public intellectual. Among many other things, he's an expert in geopolitics, Central Europe, and the Balkans. And in preparation to this conversation, I realized again that I have most, if not all, of your books on my shelves at home. So it's a great honor and pleasure for me to welcome Misha Glenny here on the stage. This was my introduction, and the plan for now is that I lean back and let Misha do the heavy lifting, and perhaps I can throw you the first question just to get into the conversation. Misha, you're just back from Ukraine, and we've seen sort of another intensified stage of the war with indiscriminate shelling, also of civilian targets. But you've been able to observe how the society is coping with the war, and perhaps also the state of Ukraine's morale. And that's sort of my first question: at what stage of the conflict are we? And perhaps more provocatively, will Ukraine win this war?
Well, so I've just come back from Lviv in Western Ukraine. I left Lviv at 5 o'clock on Monday morning, which was 2 hours before the first airstrikes hit Lviv. So Lviv had been bombed once before in the beginning stages of the war, but only about 3 kilometers outside of Lviv into what were seemingly military objects rather than civilian ones. This time, the massive bombing which took place around several cities, about 9 cities in Ukraine, were targeted both indiscriminately at civilian objects and but primarily against the energy and power grid infrastructure of Ukraine. And this is obviously a tactic in preparation for winter, which winters get pretty bitter in Ukraine, because if you knock out power systems, they are things which take quite a lot of time to repair. And so this is aimed at both hobbling the morale and the ability of civilian society to function. Now, Lviv is special because it's in the far west of Ukraine. It's far away from where the battles are taking place, but it's also the home of Ukrainian nationalism. And it has a very different atmosphere, influenced by all manner of cultures, primarily Polish, but also Austrian. It was part of the Austrian Empire for 100 years or so, slightly more than 100 years. And it's very beautiful, but it was also the main area, staging post for refugees coming from the east and internally displaced people. They all came to Lviv because it's the quickest way to get across to the Polish border. So that city, although until Monday it hadn't really experienced the direct effects of war, has recalibrated itself as basically one huge refugee reception center, many of whom then go on to Poland, but quite a lot stay there. And interestingly, this is changing the social structure of Lviv, and also, as much of this, the consequences of the war is doing, it is strengthening Ukrainian national identity. So this is a long-term consequence of Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, is he is changing the very nature of Ukraine's identity in the very opposite way that he intended. More broadly, about where the war is heading and what this all means, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, far be it from me to quote Donald Rumsfeld, who's responsible for another of the great catastrophes of the 21st century, the invasion of Iraq. We have a lot of known unknowns and, I dare say, a lot of unknown unknowns. So there is much speculation at the moment, most recently by the head of GCHQ, Britain's Digital Intelligence Service, about the capacity and capability of the Russian military to continue its war at the intensity that it is doing. It has, as we know, mobilized and is continuing to mobilize, although it's only called a partial mobilization, this is actually a general mobilization that is going on. Huge numbers of men in the Russian Federation. This is leading to an alienation, unquestionably, from Putin's leadership. It is also exercising tensions, it's stoking tensions in places like Dagestan and all along the southern periphery, where you have non-Russian populations who feel, quite understandably, because it's true, that they are making up the bulk of the population who are being thrown into the meat grinder of eastern Ukraine. Putin internationally is clearly losing. At the Samarkand summit 3 weeks ago, it's clear that Xi Jinping read the Riot Act to him about what's going on with the war. Modi distanced himself as well. The Central Asian states treated him with a level of contempt that Putin has never experienced before in his life, and he's no longer able to manage the peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have also recently seen a flare-up on their border areas when Tajikistan moved into to Kyrgyzstan. So he's losing internationally. He is doing badly in terms of public support, although that's very difficult to gauge. And he has lost quite dramatically on the eastern and southern battlefields of Ukraine over the past 3 weeks. His response to this appears to be at the moment to double down and to up Russia's military activity in Ukraine, partly through the missile strikes that we've just seen, and there will be more of those to come. And partly he is preparing to dig in along the lines that Russia now holds in preparation for the winter, where, depending on weather conditions, you're likely to see a stagnation on the battlefield. But also, very significantly, he has now told Alexander Lukashenko, Belarus's dictator, and he is a dictator, I have no qualms about using that word, to mobilize the Belarusian male population. So there are intelligence reports that there is a massing of Belarusian and Russian troops north of Kiev in Belarus, and so we might expect something coming from there. So that is where we are on the battlefield, and how that is going to play out over the winter, we don't know. One of the great unknown unknowns is, or known unknowns actually in this case, is how much pressure is Putin under within his own elites. Again, there are many rumors about jostling for position underneath Putin, but we simply don't have a fully accurate picture of what's going on. But I want to draw this out a little bit more in terms of what this means for the globe. I mentioned the Iraq invasion. On the whole, the Iraq invasion was as disastrous in terms of what it intended to do as Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, i.e. George W. Bush secured an expansion of Iranian influence in the Middle East when this was his proclaimed, goal to prevent this. And just in as much that Russia went into Ukraine based on a series of lies, so did George Bush go into Iraq on a series of lies. So there is precedent in this in terms of the way great powers behave around the world. The difference, however, is that massive though the Iraq invasion was, the implications of it tended to be restricted regionally. What has happened with Ukraine is this is having an impact over political, social, and economic processes all over the world. The first thing I did when I heard about the invasion was to ring a friend of mine who's an ambassador to the World Food Programme and the FAO in Rome, and I said, this was about a week afterwards, I said, what are you thinking? He said, we're thinking Egypt, we are thinking Sudan, we are thinking India and its grain supplies, whether it's going to be able to take up some of the slack now that Ukraine and Russia will reduce their exports. We're thinking Indonesia and Bangladesh. And then he said, and we're thinking Brazil as well. And I said, why are you thinking Brazil? He said, because the Brazilians are being told by the Americans to agree to the sanctions regime on Russia, but they haven't been consulted on this at all. And for Brazil, under Bolsonaro, what this means is they have about 68% dependency on Russian fertilizer. And although Russian fertilizers haven't been placed under sanction, it's much more difficult to get Russian fertilizers out and all the way around to the world to Brazil. And so one of the midterm responses of the Brazilian government, particularly under Bolsonaro, is to start thinking about the mining of all the potash, which is the basis of fertilizer, in the Amazon region. So a government which is already trashing the Amazon in a way that we haven't seen for 25 years in Brazil is now likely to start mining it more, especially if Bolsonaro wins the second round of the election. So you're seeing an impact with food prices, with energy prices, with inflation and the halted recovery post-pandemic. And then, of course, into the mix comes things like China's lockdowns and so on and so forth. So we suddenly are watching a perfect storm. Although there was a much vaunted unity of Europe and the United States in the immediate wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you also see fissures within Europe, fissures within countries in Europe, most notably in Germany, which is the critical country, and indeed fissures in the United States, and we have the runoff on the Brazilian election, and we have the midterms coming up in the United States, which can shift the political dynamic in the world very fundamentally. And it's certainly one thing that Vladimir Putin is watching very closely, is what happens in the United States in November this year at those midterms.
Misha, so I would like to sort of take the what you said, that this winter will be, or autumn and winter and sort of the next few weeks and months will be, if not decisive, they will be very important in I think how the conflict continues in its course. You've drawn the global picture. I'd like to move us closer to Europe, perhaps, and ask you. Sort of how does the conflict with Russia alter the political space of Europe? And here perhaps just going back to 2004 and the Big Bang enlargement back then, that for some commentators it has, or observers has felt as if Central and Eastern European member states were often not regarded as equal members of the club. The concerns about Russia were often simply not taken particularly seriously. So this in mind, and the fact that Ukraine has received sort of candidate status, Moldova, Georgia perhaps soon, it feels as if the region is giving substance to von der Leyen's idea of a geopolitical Europe, although perhaps not as she has originally intended. So the question is, how does the conflict, or how do you view the conflict to alter the political space in Europe? And perhaps more specifically, what do you think of the view that the strategic balance of power within the EU is it shifting eastwards?
Yes, I mean, in one respect it shifted eastwards massively in 2016 when the British government, in its great wisdom, decided to call a referendum on its membership of the European Union, and the UK voted to leave. And this was a big win for Vladimir Putin at the time, which explains why, through his Internet Research Agency, he did a little pro-Brexit encouragement in the run-up to the referendum. Because when the UK comes out of the European Union, there is a fundamental security issue going on there, which is you break the relationship between the Five Eyes intelligence gathering network of the main Anglophone countries, and the European Union. Anything that fragmented the European Union, Putin saw as a victory. This is why he has been encouraging, as indeed financed, parties, particularly like Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National and the AfD in Germany. It's notable that Berlusconi remains very keen on Putin, so does Salvini in Italy, and so on. So all of that fragmentation and the existing internal tensions within Europe, Putin didn't make these things up. You know, this is Europe coming to terms with the consequences of the financial crash of 2008. But the great victory within that framework was Brexit. So that immediately shifts power slightly to the east. And then you get the emergence of right-wing governments in Poland and Hungary who form a relationship and start to assert their rights within the European Union as they perceive them. Interestingly, that hitherto iron friendship between Poland and Hungary shattered on the 24th of February, literally within 24 hours, because Orban is much more tied up with Russia, and Poland is not tied up with Russia, and so there are tensions within that bloc as well. But overall, Eastern Europe is coming within the European Union, which is exactly how it should be. Their societies are improving economically. Poland will, at some point within the next 5 years, become a net contributor to the European Union. And this is something which I don't think that German political discourse has fully appreciated yet, that there is a shift towards the new member states from 2004. But they too are subject to the same processes of polarization that we see elsewhere in the world, and the current lines may not last, they may last, we simply don't know. That's another unknown. But overall, yes, power is shifting, and they are, the East Europeans, with the exception of Hungary, and you can possibly put in one or two of the Southeast European states as well, are much more resolute in their support for Ukraine than Germany appears to be.
Before opening the floor, there's one more thing I would like to put on the table here, also specifically with a view to the fact that we have a good number of officials from EU accession countries here in the room, where progress on opening new chapters has essentially been stalled for years for a number of different reasons. And your IWM colleague Ivan Krastev wrote a piece in the summer saying that the EU is losing control of events on its conflict-ridden periphery. And more recently, in an interview, he predicted that the EU integration process would fundamentally change as a consequence of the Ukraine crisis. Misha, what do you think the Ukraine crisis means for the European integration project more generally?
Well, if European Union member states had the capacity to do so, they would be looking very closely at Southeastern Europe in particular. The great mistake with Southeastern Europe in recent years was President Macron's decision not to allow the candidate status of North Macedonia and Albania in 2019. That sent a hugely negative figure throughout Southeastern Europe. They've been waiting for membership that they had been promised in 2003. Some of them have made progress on the criteria, some of them haven't. If you look at the 2004 expansion, there were various areas, various criteria, which almost all of the aspirant states did not actually meet. And so the process of accession, although it is grounded in a conditional system, a system of conditions, it also can be flexible when necessary. For example, one of the criteria early on was that you could not include a country which did not control all of its territory, and Cyprus was absorbed into the European Union nonetheless. So there aren't many people in the Western Balkans relative to the population of the European Union. Absorbing them would be very easy. They have no difficulty entering either the European Union and working in the European Union, or the United Kingdom for that matter, as it is. If you go to the UK, the building industry is entirely dominated now by Kosovar Albanians or Albanians proper, and they have not come in on visas. They've all come in through the back door, as it were, or at least a large number of them have. So Europe clearly needs the labour force. I mean, it's another issue about the brain drain from Southeastern Europe, but we won't go into that now. But if the European Union starts focusing its attention primarily on Ukraine and Moldova and allows the aspirant states of the Western Balkans to continue to stew in the waiting rooms of accession, then we are going to see difficulties. There is a lot of criticism at the moment of Aleksandar Vučić, the president of Serbia. He hasn't joined in sanctions on Russia. He has, however, significantly condemned Russia at key moments in the UN and in other fora. And what Vučić is doing, but quite understandably, because Serbia has the issue of Kosovo, which is a topic unto itself, is he's waiting to see, you know, what's going to happen. Is Russia going to win this war? Is the EU going to register essentially a political success in Ukraine? He knows his own society is divided, and so in some respects he has little choice but to play both games, which is what he's doing. If the EU were to focus more determinedly, and certainly its special representative Miroslav Lajčák is doing this, and there are signs of a breakthrough between Kosovo and Serbia literally in the past 72 hours. If the EU were to really put its weight behind the absorption, at the very least, of Albania and North Macedonia, and possibly, although it's questionable at the moment, Montenegro as well, then you would see a shift in Southeastern Europe. You would see a diminishing of Russian influence, and it's all about Russian influence in Southeastern Europe in the short to mid-term. In the long term, it's all about Chinese influence. And if the EU doesn't get its act together in what is an absolutely critical strategic area for its development, then it will, in all probability, come to regret it in 5 to 10 years' time. We'll see. The membership process for Ukraine and Moldova complicates all of this, although the EU is under huge pressure, both internally and externally, to go down that path.
With that, I would like to now loop the colleagues from the floor in. I'm sure that there's reactions here. Many of the topics are very important and key for the work that we are doing. So, are there any immediate reactions? We have a couple of minutes more. Oh, here in front, Madame El Fadil, if you could hand her the microphone.
Okay, my name is Amir Al Fadil. I work for ICISCO. I'm a former commissioner at the African Union and a member of the advisory board of ICMPD. I know this war between Russia and Ukraine is affecting Europe greatly, but I always think about us in Africa and how much we are affected by this war. And my question to you is, are we in an era that's similar to the Cold War era? And are we in our developing and underdeveloped countries? I know we are very greatly affected, especially when it comes to food security issues. Many of our countries depend on the grains that comes from Russia and Ukraine, the fuel issue. So we have our problems at home that's not allowing us to take a clear decision or a clear position on where to stand. And we are asked by what you call them, the known unknowns, to take positions. How come we take positions, and I'm speaking about our countries, how are we going to take positions Yes, out of humanity, we should take very clear position, but how come are we going to do it while we are affected greatly by our internal problems, which is related to food security issues? And how the world would understand that if a country is not taking a clear position to say, yes, I'm against this war, yes, and who is going to solve our problems internally with our people internally? That's my question to you. But another question is it a beginning of a third world war or not? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can take one or two more if there are immediate reactions. Hugo?
Two very quick questions. Hugo Brady, ICMPD. So, Misha, you've just come back from leave, and obviously I don't want this question to sound twee or inappropriate, but when Europeans themselves are debating this war, even though everybody feels huge sorrow for Ukraine, but then there are, of course, the opinion, oh, but you know, what do you say when someone comes to you and says, but we need to give Vladimir Putin an exit from this conflict. We shouldn't humiliate him. Russia needs an off-ramp. You know, this kind of school of opinion. I mean, what is your response to that? And very small question, well, big topic, small question. How do we get Britain back into the European family? You're an Irish citizen now, which I'm very proud of.
Yes. Yes, I am. I'm an Irish citizen thanks to the goodwill of the Irish government, because I have a grandfather who in 1896 had the intelligence to be born in Newry, County Down, which is in Northern Ireland, and because of my surname and because of when the Glennys arrived in Ireland in the beginning of the 17th century, people from Ireland will know that the Irish government has no particular reason to be kind to me, but they have been, so I'm very grateful to that. Africa and the Global South and this war. This is a really good question, and it's why I mentioned my conversation about food supplies first of all. And I quite understand how people in the Global South, when the West comes calling and say this is all about Russian imperialism and you've got to support us with sanctions and so on, how there is room for, what can I say, a certain degree of skepticism in the Global South about those messages when the United States and Europe come calling, talking about imperialism. So it's a very difficult thing to discuss. Vladimir Putin has focused his propaganda campaign promoting his narrative of the war much more on the Global South than it has on Europe, because he knows this is where the vulnerability is, because the impact in terms of people's living standards is much higher in the Global South than it is in Europe, notwithstanding energy costs and so on in Europe. So I think the main thing that the Global South would probably benefit from, but it's difficult to explain why this is so, is obviously an end to this war ASAP. As soon as possible, we need this war to end so that food prices can come down and food supplies can be secured. This then links around to two other questions: the World War III question and the off-ramp, and indeed the Cold War. We are no longer in the Cold War, although people like to call about Cold War 2.0 or the new Cold War. The point about the Cold War is that largely, apart of course from the proxy wars in the Global South and occasionally massive interventions like Vietnam, the Cold War had a certain political stability about it which no longer pertains around the world. And so this is not a Cold War, it's something else. We haven't come up with a good description yet, but it has a lot of multiple interlocking contexts, conflicts which are appropriate, and contacts which are appropriate for this multipolar world. So, and this then relates, what should the Global South be doing? What should the Global South be arguing? This relates to the issue of the off-ramp. and Putin. The problem for all of us is that Putin increasingly, over his 22 years in power, which is far too long for anyone to be in power, in my opinion, has increasingly identified the Russian state with his own personality. And what this means is that the more this war ramps up, the more his personal capital is mixed with what his perception of the state capital of Russia is being invested in this war. So the weaker Russia appears to be in the war, and if it looks as though there may be some form of major defeat for him going in this war, the more he is threatened personally, and the more tempted he is to escalate and ramp up things. So what he's doing all the time, even with the attacks on Ukraine at the moment, he's sending messages to Ukraine, obviously, but his main message is to try and tell Germany and other European Union states that he is not afraid of escalation. And knowing that Germany is split between whether it should look for a peace deal, which the Ukrainians don't want at the moment, but which there is some popular pressure for in Germany, or not. And hence he's now using the threat of a nuclear escalation. Intelligence analysts at the moment are chatting a lot about whether we go to nuclear escalation. One use of a battlefield tactical nuclear weapon won't be devastating in terms of the damage it does, but it means that the principle of first use is thrown out of the window, and then we are in an entirely different world. The world is in a more dangerous situation, a really serious situation than it's been since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. No question about it. I would say it's possibly even more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. So all of these things may come to pass. I don't see at the moment what off-ramp can be constructed. There is quietly, in the chancelleries of Europe and in the United States, there are people working on this, trying to come up with a plan, and you see President Erdogan in Turkey engaged in this as well, trying to come up with a plan that would be vaguely acceptable as a beginning to both Kiev and Moscow. But all of us who are thinking about this are at the moment finding it very, very difficult to see how either side is likely to pull back from what at the moment appear to be maximalist demands. So I haven't really answered your question about the global south, which I'll come back to. And what I would say is that it's the most important thing for the global south is to make sure that this war comes to an end. But I would also recognize, if I was in the global south, notwithstanding your history with the West and how damaging that history has been, I would recognize that this is also, that Russia is also engaged in an imperialist project here. It's just not affecting, it's not affecting your countries for this moment. And to finish off with, Hugo, your question about the United Kingdom. So the weekend after the war began, I had a long conversation with a friend of mine in Washington, very depressed conversation on both our sides, for about 50 minutes, analyzing what the war was. We were both thoroughly miserable at the end. But just before he put the phone down, he said there's one bright spot. He's well connected with the intelligence services in the United States. I said, what's that? He says the CIA analytics unit have confirmed that the war in Ukraine is likely to accelerate Britain's return to the single market by about 5 years. They're now anticipating 2029. And if the events in the United Kingdom in the past 2 weeks are anything to go by, the sooner the better.
Misha, I'm afraid we have to wrap it up here. But I think we are very stimulated now to go into the discussions that we have ahead of us on the external perspective on the migratory challenges, and then moving on to the EU. There's more reactions, but I cannot take any more reactions. What I would recommend to all of you that would like to get deeper into this, there is a strong program on the IWM side. There's regular events, and if you want sort of to get deeper into it, look out for next year's Humanities Festival, which will, I'm sure, be again a very stimulating event. I'm personally looking very much forward to it. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Misha in a round of applause.
Thank you.